I think drivers have been a little bit coddled, even by the messages they're getting from the media, from car commercials, from the way we're designing streets, even from safety officials, sort of have fed into this idea that they have like this, uninterrupted right to the road. Mm-hmm. Anyone who gets in their way and delays them for even a second has violated their rights somehow. And it's a really dangerous concept, and we really need to rethink that.
All too often, we prioritize drivers over everyone else using roadways. Author Angie Schmitt says that's a big problem in St. Louis and everywhere in the country.
A lot of suburbs were built sort of later in the last century, in sort of the height of the auto era in the United States, the height of suburbanization and post-war design, which was very car-centric, right? And a lot of suburban layout, it feeds all the traffic into these wide arterial roads that are often very fast and for obvious reasons are really dangerous to people on foot.
I'm Sarah Fenske. This is St. Louis on the Air. Later in the show, we'll talk with transportation policy planner Scott Ogilvie about how our region could address the issues we'll talk about today. The issues Angie Schmitt covers in her new book run the gamut from curb cuts to deadly drivers. As she shows, small decisions can have a big human toll. Tiffany Stanfield knows that all too well. 4 years ago, her sister, Jamaica, was killed in the city of St. Louis. Jamaica Stanfield was not a victim of gunfire. She was simply trying to cross North Grand Boulevard to get to her car. And that's when a woman driving a red Lexus ES 350 crashed into her at 80 miles an hour. For Jamaica's sister, Tiffany Stanfield, that day changed everything.
April 12, 2016 was the day that changed my life. It was a day that should have been celebratory because it was my mother's birthday, but it ended up being a day that has impacted me emotionally and mentally because I lost my only sister to a hard, which in my world is considered a hit-and-run driver. And this driver was traveling 80 miles per hour down a main street, and my sister, like any pedestrian would do, was at the corner crosswalk. She chirped her car. At least this is what the witnesses state. She stepped off the curb, and that was the last of her. This car hit her and drove off.
When Tiffany Stanfield couldn't find her sister, she did some sleuthing, and that's when she found out the terrible truth.
I basically contacted the coroner. The coroner didn't contact me. I contacted the coroner feeling like, and I quote, "I know you have my sister." It was a very unorthodox call, so much to a point where the coroner was compelled to say, I have to unofficially tell you this, and I'm not supposed to do this, but based on the information you provided to me, yes, we have your sister.
And that was a harbinger of what was to come in the case against the driver who killed Jamaica Stanfield. Tiffany Stanfield said that trying to get information, much less justice, proved incredibly frustrating. Nobody seemed to care about Jamaica's death as much as her family did.
The many doors that I couldn't get through, really trying to get details on her case, the fact that we had to actually hire individuals to help us investigate my sister's case, or the fact that I was feeding information to the detectives because they just simply wasn't focused on our case, is the unheard voices of the victim.
Now, ultimately, with the family's help, the police did identify the driver. She was charged and pleaded not guilty. Frustratingly for the family, the woman died in jail while awaiting trial. But while Jamaica Stanfield's case is unique in many ways, it's far from unique in many, many others. In 2018, 6,283 pedestrians were killed in the U.S. in car crashes. That includes 44 people in Metro St. Louis. That's according to the National Highway Safety Administration. Now, we may think of these deaths as accidents. We may say that short of tracking down individual drivers and holding them accountable, there's nothing we can do. Well, Angie Schmitt disagrees. In her new book, she argues that our focus on individual error obscures the real truth. We've created an environment where pedestrians are walking ducks at the mercy of a landscape built for fast-moving cars and giant SUVs. Angie Schmitt's book is called Right of Way: Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. And she joins us today to talk about it. So Angie Schmitt, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
You start your book by noting that many more pedestrians are killed by cars today than 10 years ago. How big is this problem?
Yeah, so in the past decade, there's been about a 50% increase, which is really unusual in traffic safety. Generally, since the 1970s, over time, traffic safety has improved. And this, all of a sudden, pedestrian safety is going in the complete opposite direction.
Well, I know a lot of people think they know why, and they say, hey, pedestrians are distracted by smartphones. We've all bumped into somebody who's looking at their phone. It is annoying. But as you say in this book, there's a lot of things that indicate that's not the case. Can you walk us through some of the ways you were able to demolish that theory?
Right. Well, for one thing, they're in other nations where they have a similar use of smartphones, like Canada, like parts of Western Europe, they have not seen the same trend. So there's nothing universal about smartphones and rising pedestrian deaths. And the sort of knee-jerk impulse to blame pedestrians is pretty off base in this case. We can say pretty confidently for a few reasons. And one is that about 75% of pedestrian deaths happen at night. So, I mean, people could still be distracted on their cell phone at night, but it seems a little less likely. In addition, they're more likely to be killed outside of crosswalks. So, again, more stressful crossing situations that might not be as relaxed and tempting to, like, check Facebook, right? And thirdly, the kind of people that are being killed, it's disproportionately elderly folks, low-income folks, people of color, some demographic groups that are sort of less likely to be wired.
So, yeah, those statistics seem pretty compelling there. It's interesting. We asked our listeners what they thought was the biggest driver in the increase in pedestrian deaths. And the way this poll was set up, we could only include 4 options. Our listeners voted for distracted drivers. They said 49% chose that. 29% chose poor infrastructure. 16% chose America's huge vehicles. And distracted pedestrians came up in the rear with just 4%. So maybe our listeners they did not fall for this argument, but it seems to be something a lot of people think, and they also want to blame pedestrians. And a lot of people think these are happening in these crowded streets, places like New York City. That's not true either. What did you find out about where these deaths are happening?
Right. So actually, cities like New York, older cities in the Northeast and the Midwest are some of the more safe places to walk. The most dangerous places are in the southeast of the United States. Places like Florida, Phoenix, Dallas, Houston, those are the most dangerous places for pedestrians. And in addition, suburban areas of a lot of cities are very dangerous.
So that suburban thing, that really caught me by surprise when I read that in your book. But you outlined some reasons why. What's going on there that the suburbs would be more dangerous than a close-built downtown?
Right. Yeah. A lot of suburbs were built sort of later in the last century, in sort of the height of the auto era in the United States, the height of suburbanization and post-war design, which was very car-centric, right? And a lot of suburban layout, it feeds all the traffic into these wide arterial roads that are often very fast and for obvious reasons are really dangerous to people on foot.
And these people who are trying to cross there, as you say, these don't tend to be people who are likely to be wired. These are people who don't have cars in many cases.
Right. If you look at who's most at risk for these kind of deaths, it's sort of a overlapping series of marginalization, right? People who are disabled are at a little higher risk. People of color, Black and Hispanic folks and Native folks are at increased risk. Elderly folks, people who are lower income, and then, people who meet one or more of those criteria, their risk would be even higher.
Do you think that's one big reason this is, as you say, a silent epidemic, that the powers that be are less likely to care if it's somebody who's lower income or somebody who's a person of color?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. I think it hasn't been recognized as a public health crisis because so many of us are so privileged that we're sort of never put in this position where we're having to cross a 6 or 7 lane arterial road with very high speeds to catch a bus at night that only comes once every hour, right? Mm-hmm. We're just not, and so we're not sympathetic to people who are in that position. And there's not enough people who have been put in that position in sort of leadership positions across government and media and a lot of the places that are more influential.
I thought it was interesting. You note that the way that the media frames these things, that we're part of the problem. It's interesting. You actually coincidentally just quoted the St. Louis papers of the 1920s as an example of how much things have changed. The St. Louis Star called drivers who cause pedestrian fatalities, quote, killers. And the Post-Dispatch said this in 1923. Even in the case of children, quote, darting in the street in the excitement of play, the plea of unavoidable accident in such cases is the perjury of a murderer. That's such strong language and clearly putting the blame on the driver. When do you think that started to shift and why?
Yeah, there's a guy at University of Virginia, a historian, that wrote a really good book about this. But early in the last century, when cars in the 20s and 30s, when cars first started making their way into cities, there was a lot of outrage about immediately people started getting killed, and disproportionately they were children. So people were really, really upset. And it was actually considered sort of a threat by the auto industry. And one of the ways they came up with to combat that pushback was this idea of jaywalking. And in this book, this guy, Peter Norton, he introduces this. He calls it sort of the invention of jaywalking. So that concept is really fundamental now to the way we look at this problem. And when someone is killed, very often the knee-jerk impulse is just to blame them. Well, they weren't in a crosswalk. So they sort of deserved it, which I think is very cruel in a way.
And when you say the invention of jaywalking, prior to them coming up with this, it wasn't a crime to just cross the street wherever you wanted to cross it.
Right. And in a lot of our peer nations, like in Europe, there is no equivalent crime of jaywalking. A lot of countries, I might add, that have a lot better traffic safety records.
You mentioned outrage and, that we don't really direct outrage to drivers anymore. We tend to reserve it for pedestrians that we think are just crossing in the middle of the street. You wrote about a case in Georgia that just absolutely stopped me in my tracks. This is one of the most horrifying things I'd ever read. And this is the case of Raquel Nelson. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah, so she was a 29-year-old single mother, and she was living in a suburban area of northern metro Atlanta. And she was dependent on the bus, and she had taken her 3 children out for pizza. And when she returned, she missed her bus, and so it was a little bit late. Long story short, as she's crossing the street, she lives across from a pretty fast road. As she's crossing the street from her bus stop to her apartment complex, her son, her 3-year-old son, AJ, got out of her grasp and was hit by a driver. And it was a hit-and-run driver, and he was killed. So the really upsetting part about all this, obviously losing her son is really tragic, but the whole situation was compounded because the prosecutor in Cobb County, where she lived, chose to charge her, the mother, with vehicular homicide. And his logic was that she was jaywalking, so she was responsible for her son's death.
And like I said, this one just stopped me in my tracks. It's horrible to think that somebody would have done this to this woman. But as you point out in this book, these jaywalking laws tend to be used disproportionately towards people of color. There's a real race issue on some of these laws and the way they're being enforced.
Yeah, that's correct. Almost everywhere it's been analyzed, the enforcement of jaywalking has been found to be racially biased. There was a really good investigation out of Jacksonville, Florida, a few years ago, and it found that in that city, black people were 3 times as likely as white people to be stopped and ticketed for jaywalking, I'm sorry. And in the most poor neighborhoods, black and brown people were 6 times as likely.
And some people might say, hey, they're just doing this to keep them safe. People are being killed by these cars. What can we do? That's something that we're going to talk about when we come back after our break. So, Angie, I know you have a lot of thoughts on that subject. I want to make sure we have time for that. And we're talking today to Angie Schmitt. She's the author of Right of Way. That's Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
And now back to our conversation. We're talking to Angie Schmitt. Her new book is Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. And in just a bit, we're going to open our phone lines and we'll give the floor to Scott Ogilvie, who's a transportation policy planner for the city of St. Louis. He'll talk to us about where he sees the city improving and a lot of areas where they could do even better. But I want to talk to Angie a bit about solutions. The fact is, even if we can get over blaming individual victims, we often want to blame individual drivers. And Angie's book really set me straight on that. There are a lot of bad drivers out there, in St. Louis in particular. But there's some bigger problems here, and these are problems that we can do something about. So, Angie, I'm curious, if you had to reduce it to one thing, and I know you have so many good ideas in this book, but what is the number one thing we could do to reduce pedestrian deaths?
Yeah, so I think if you imagine driving on a highway, everything you sort of need to be safe is in place. If you need a guardrail, it's there. The signs are there, the stripes are there. So everything you need is sort of there. And that's not the case with our city roads, our state roads, the kind of roads people are walking on. A lot of times, basic pieces of infrastructure are missing, whether that's sidewalks or curb ramps or street lights are really important, or bus shelters. So I think we have to sort of go back. We've built a lot of big highways, and the interstate system is sort of complete now. It still needs to be maintained, but we should go back to the roads we've built that people are walking on and do the things we need to do so that they can walk safely or wheel.
Do you feel crosswalks are maybe the most important thing to have more that are well lit and that drivers have to pay attention to? Or are sidewalks an equally big part of this if we had a more complete sidewalk system?
That's a good question. It's sort of, you really need both. You're not going to get too far without sidewalks or crosswalks. There aren't enough crosswalks in a lot of places, and the crosswalks aren't safe enough. Sometimes just 2 stripes across 8 lanes, without enough time on the walk signal is not going to be good enough to keep people safe either. So there needs to be more thought put into all of that. More people in positions of influence need to experience it as a person on foot or using a wheelchair. And it really is sort of localized. So certain streets in St. Louis, the problem might be street lighting. Certain other streets, it may be the road's width. It might be the lack of sidewalk continuity, that type of thing.
So take a careful look at all of these problem streets, figure out what the individual problem is, then figure out a way to address it.
Right. And in most cities, there's just a handful of streets that account for a wildly disproportionate share of these kind of crashes and injuries. So a lot of cities are using mapping to identify those streets and those intersections as sort of the place to start and focus their efforts at first.
It's good you mentioned that. We actually did create a map. You can find that on our Twitter. That's STL on air. And that map shows the deaths in 2018 in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. And obviously that's just a snapshot. There have been so many deaths over the past decades, but there are some streets we can be honing in on here. Something else you mentioned in your book, you had a great anecdote about these researchers in St. Paul, Minnesota. They conducted an experiment at great personal peril where they were kind of testing the laws there. Tell us a little bit about that experiment and what they learned from it.
Yeah, so they were trying to improve yielding rates for drivers. So we all know about jaywalking, and a lot of people get, I think, a little bit irrationally upset about jaywalking. But at the same time, drivers are sort of not holding up their end of the bargain, which is yielding to pedestrians. And a lot of research shows yielding rates for drivers in uncontrolled crosswalks, those are crosswalks without traffic lights, traffic signals, is only about 16%. So this researcher at a University of Minnesota, she had people out testing how often drivers were yielding, and then they used certain psychological tricks to try and improve the yielding rate. And one of the most interesting things they did was they posted a sign every week that showed what percentage of drivers were yielding. So originally it was only about 30%. So they posted this sign and it said 30-something% of drivers in St. Paul yielded to pedestrians last week. And that really got people thinking and talking about that behavior.
You also talk about the ideology of flow. People often work really hard at City Hall to lobby for changes like getting more time in a crosswalk or more stop signs. And we may think we're the victim of City Hall when we don't get them. But I learned in your book it's much bigger than that. What is the real culprit of this idea that we prioritize flow over the walkability of our streets?
Right. Yeah. There's sort of a institutional bias in the traffic engineering profession, and it is improving, but it's still present. That has really, it really has prioritized time savings for drivers over the safety of people on foot and even people in cars, even passengers to some extent. And I think it's a really bad trade-off because these injuries and these deaths they're very costly to society and for the families that they impact. And meanwhile, this time savings is often quite negligible. But you see it in like the way traffic signals are programmed. They often will only give pedestrians a few seconds to cross, not enough time, say, for someone who's a little bit older or uses a mobility device. And when we do that, we're making a conscious decision to prioritize, a few seconds of savings for drivers over someone's safety and well-being.
And you say you are starting to see that attitude change, that some cities are really understanding that flow is not the be-all, end-all. Do you think that's something that we're going to see, a sea change in the U.S. in maybe the next decade?
I hope so. I hope we will come to reevaluate it. I think it's something we should think about more sort of morally, the way we get around and the moral implications of the way we drive and the way we design our cities. Because at the end of the day, it could be any of us. Like, we all sacrifice a little bit of freedom. Maybe we can't let our kids walk to school, that type of thing. And I think our priorities have been a little bit out of whack.
Well, we've gotten an earful from our listeners on this issue when we let them know that you were going to come on. People had so many thoughts about this. People are so angry about the situation on the ground, and hopefully that can lead to some changes here. One of the things we kept hearing over and over is just how selfish drivers are. I'm just going to read an excerpt from our St. Louis on the Air Facebook group, which if anyone's listening, you're welcome to join this. We often discuss our ideas before the show, and we draw on them and we shape these conversations. And Carrie writes on Facebook, "It is amazing how selfish drivers can be, even in a designated crosswalk with the signal indicating my right-of-way. I have narrowly dodged cars that speed through regardless. I am sometimes with children or folks who have limited mobility or dogs. It doesn't seem to matter residential or commercial. Drivers fly by with zero consideration or respect at far over the posted speed limit. One day, someone going 55 miles per hour down my street in Dutchtown is going to run me over when I am unloading groceries with a moment's distraction. Totally unacceptable." Brent writes on Facebook, "Our city is terrible for pedestrians. Visit other cities like New Orleans or San Francisco, and you can pretty much just walk across the city. Here, that's totally not the case, and you generally limit your path of foot travel to not cross highways or train overpasses. For instance, traveling down Kings Highway or Grand is completely implausible. People in the city will lay on their horn while you're walking through an intersection during your turn. In San Francisco, if a motorist tried that, their car would be attacked by a claw hammer or a brick before the next light." Angie, is there anything we can do about the attitude of entitlement that so many drivers seem to have?
Yeah, I think addressing it like that pretty plainly is a good step. I think drivers have been a little bit coddled even by the messages they're getting from the media, from car commercials, from the way we're designing streets, even from safety officials sort of have fed into this idea that they have this uninterrupted right to the road. Mm-hmm. Anyone who gets in their way and delays them for even a second has violated their rights somehow. And it's a really dangerous concept, and we really need to rethink that.
And part of what it makes so dangerous, I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on one other area that listener after listener cited and that you cover in great depth in this great book, and that's the fact that SUVs are getting bigger and bigger. And some of the research you found about what's driving that, it's very interesting psychologically what's going on here. Is this part of the problem of why drivers feel the way they do, that they're frankly driving around in tanks?
Yes, I think very much so. We've seen a huge increase. It's one of the things that explains this big increase in pedestrian deaths we've seen. Americans are trading regular sedans, smaller cars for SUVs and increasingly enormous pickup trucks. And I do think there's an inherent power dynamic or power differential between pedestrians and drivers in the first place. Pedestrians, if they tangle with a car, always lose, right? Mm-hmm. So as these cars get bigger and bigger, that differential gets more and more lopsided. And it's sort of sad and upsetting that people seem to be willing to pay huge premiums on cars for a car that looks a little bit more violent and aggressive. And it turns out really is having a very negative impact on pedestrian safety.
These SUVs, again, this is something where we might think of this as an individual choice and want to shake our fist at people who are buying these SUVs. But you actually see some bigger picture solutions here. What are some things the government could do that would make SUVs a bit safer for those of us who are in their path?
Right. So in the U.S., we regulate vehicles for safety. That includes all kinds of things like seat belts and anti-lock brakes. But almost all those regulations, and there's hundreds of pages of these, they all just protect passengers and drivers. There hasn't been hardly anything to protect pedestrians and cyclists and other vulnerable road users. And that needs to change if we're going to address this. There's really no excuse for it now. During the Obama administration, they had proposed at least rating cars for pedestrian safety impacts, so they would at least car buyers would at least be warned if their vehicle was really dangerous for pedestrians. But that was quashed during the Trump administration. But there's other things we could do from a regulatory standpoint, like there's new technologies coming online, like automatic pedestrian detection that can prevent these wrecks from occurring. But the federal government has not moved to require it in all vehicles or even in the vehicles that we know present special harms, like big SUVs and pickups.
Yeah, it seems a lot less necessary in a nice little Toyota Corolla than in one of these that can cause so much damage just with a hit. It's interesting. You note that one big problem is there just hasn't been that much outcry about some of these situations, the SUV standards, about these deaths in general. If people feel like crying out after they're listening to this or after reading your book, what do you think is the best place to take that anger or to channel it to actually cause some of these changes that we've talked about today?
Yeah, so what I tell people is some of this is just sort of being good citizenship you know? So if you don't actually do any walking around your house, I would encourage you to try it, to go out and see what it's like to wait at the bus stop near your house, see how it feels to try and cross a street, even at night. Now, you have to be careful, but if you're seeing things that are a problem, reach out to your elected leaders, write a letter to the editor, that kind of thing. And there may be an advocacy organization, I'm sure there is, in St. Louis that's sort of working to advance the rights of pedestrians and cyclists and helping support them and get plugged in with those groups. Those groups are often really underfunded and could use a lot more support.
Well, there is so much in this book, Angie. I feel like we barely touched the surface here, and we've given it more time than we often give books, to be honest. But it seems like such an important topic, and you've done such good work in exposing this problem and identifying some solutions. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for your great interview. I really appreciate it.
And Angie is, again, the author of Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. You can find a link to that on our website if you're interested in getting this book. I highly recommend this one. And coming up, we're going to discuss how some of these things apply in the St. Louis area. And we'll have that conversation with Scott Ogilvie. He's a former alderman and transportation policy planner with the city of St. Louis. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU. Welcome back. St. Louis is not, in fact, Exhibit A in Angie Schmitt's book. As she described for us earlier, it's really these sprawling Sunbelt cities that have the biggest problem with pedestrian deaths. But St. Louis has also seen an increase. On our website, you can see a map that shows where pedestrians were killed in 2018. You can also see the number of pedestrian deaths in St. Louis City and St. Louis County going back 10 years. And the new norm, this is obviously pre-COVID when so many people stopped driving, but that was much higher than it was 10 years ago. So what should St. Louis do to reverse that trend as a city and as a region? Well, joining us today to talk about how some of these issues play out locally is Scott Ogilvie. He's a former St. Louis alderman, he's an advocate for cyclists, and he's a transportation policy planner for the city of St. Louis. So, Scott, welcome to the show.
Hi, Sarah. Good afternoon.
So, as a transportation planner, how do pedestrian concerns play into the work that you do? Are they a big deal?
Well, yes, for my particular work, I mean, that's really a focus of my job and very much part of my role within the planning department. And my role is really to always be emphasizing more vulnerable road users in every project we do and at every stage of the project, from conceptual design to construction. And it's not just me, but we certainly have people across many departments in the city of St. Louis who are a lot more keen on those topics than you would have found, I think, 10 or 15 years ago. So I think there are many areas where we're making progress, but we are also in some sense swimming upstream because of many of the things that Angie mentioned, things like distracted driving, cell phone usage for drivers, larger vehicles with less visibility, traveling at higher speeds. And I think across the country, there's definitely a movement and there's tons of interest in cities across the country in emphasizing pedestrian safety and streets that balance all users in a better way than most streets do that were built between, say 1940 and 1990. Those tended to really prioritize vehicles and the driver. And it takes a long time to undo that and to retrofit things. But I think the projects we're doing now and the projects we have on the drawing board that we're planning for, pedestrian safety, accessibility, and vehicle safety too, is very much at the top of the list for the things we're doing now.
I want to touch on those construction projects for a moment. We talked about sidewalks last year on this show. We were joined by David Newberger, who's St. Louis's commissioner on the disabled. And we talked about the fact that, the city had approved a project that basically shut down the sidewalk on both sides of Forest Park near Vandevenner. And David frankly admitted that it was a mistake, that the city had accidentally done this. And, once it moved forward, it was too late to revoke permission, but that this was a problem. He talked talked about making temporary walkways like you see in New York City when construction takes over the area of a sidewalk. The sidewalk is built in a way that it then can go out into what used to be the car space and give people the chance to still continue to remain on the sidewalk without having to cross the street. Is that something that we're seeing yet in St. Louis in a new construction project?
Yeah, so we've updated our policy since that incident. Alderwoman Ingracia passed a new ordinance, so the Streets Department, which regulates that, is approaching that differently. And I hope we have a lot better results going forward, because I agree with David Neuberger. That was an oversight, and we don't want to have situations where long construction projects really limit mobility or force people on foot into dangerous situations.
Well, we have so many people who are hoping to join this conversation, so I'm going to go to the phone lines. Ron is calling from Ferguson. Ron, hi, you're on St. Louis on the Air.
Yes, I would just like to say, I've noticed since the Mike Brown situation where police have not been giving out tickets and I think it's unintended consequences, but I see people driving at 60, 70 miles an hour. They have no fear of the police. There are no more red cameras. And then when they do catch people, they're pretty much aren't punished. I own a building that's been hit twice by speeding cars in the city. All 4 buildings on the corners have been hit by cars, and about 5 people that live in that area have had cars totaled by people just speeding, going around this particular curve and wiping out. And that happened to me, to my building. The guy didn't have any insurance. He had a suspended license. Nothing.
Ron, I think you're making a great point here, and I hear this from so many people. St. Louis just seems to be a free-for-all sometimes on the streets, and whether or not that's related to the death of Michael Brown, as Ron believes, or whether St. Louis police just aren't interested in enforcing traffic laws, this seems to be a problem that's on a lot of people's minds. Is the city aware of this and planning to change anything as far as this goes, Scott?
Yes, so, those types of incidents have been on the rise across the country during the pandemic. And while there's been lower volumes of vehicles on the road, there's been a lot more excessive speeding and reckless or criminal driving. Mm-hmm. I would say that the primary means to correct that is road design. And if you see projects like we've got, MoDOT is constructing a natural bridge right now, which has not been a safe corridor for anybody. Mm-hmm. There's a major road diet that's going to be a much safer road section when it's completed. They just did a center island on North Riverview, which was not a safe route for drivers. We have funded reconstruction of Jefferson Avenue from Market up to Natural Bridge, which will include medians. Those types of designs do a lot to limit the capacity for drivers to engage in excessive speeding. Enforcement by police is a fraught issue, mm-hmm. and I think we should, not be doing enforcement for minor infractions. But I don't think we can abandon enforcement altogether for things that are reckless and criminal and really endangering other people. There has to be some expectation that if you're driving, 70 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, that you may be pulled over.
It does seem like we should be able to agree on that. Yeah. And as you say, drunk drivers, we can't have that. And we seem to have a lot of them. Well, I want to thank Ron for that call. Let's go back to the phone line. Shannon is calling from Webster Groves. Shannon, hi, you're on St. Louis on the Air.
Hi. Yeah, I was just calling because we had a construction project maybe 2 years ago where traffic was rerouted down our street, and my daughter, who was 4 at the time, was almost hit by a pickup truck who was speeding. And so we started looking at speed limits and just traffic safety in general because it was just right by our house. And we looked at it. We had friends take pictures all of their speed limit signs all around St. Louis County. And Webster Groves was much higher than most, especially with our older residential roads. And so there's been discussion to do an audit of the Webster Groves speed limits in general. But that has stalled. It's taken a while to get that going, and they were about to start it, and the pandemic hit.
Okay. So when you say that stalled, it's not that it ran into political headwinds. It's just the complications of 2020.
Well, yeah, but I mean, we did get a lot of pushback from the chief of police. They didn't want to do that. I think enforcement is an issue. It's something that maybe they're not equipped to handle, or, it's just something they don't have prioritized to handle. Because if they were to lower the speed limit, then there would have to be some enforcement. And so what they really talked about and what they touted was the 85 percentile method, where when you, and they did a test like speed trap to see how fast drivers are going. And if 85% of the drivers go a certain speed, then that is deemed the safe speed. But there's a lot of critics of that method, because I was reading up on it, and what happens over time is something called speed creep, where drivers get used to and comfortable with the roads they're driving, and they start going over what is actually safe. So drivers shouldn't really be setting the speed limits. It's something that should also take pedestrian traffic into account.
That you make a great point there. And hearing about what's underway in Webster Groves, it seems like there's a movement to try to deal with some of this stuff there. As Shannon says, they may run into some trouble with that. But Scott, it sounds like this group is barking up the right tree there.
Yeah, the caller brings up some very hot topics in the transportation world. And I think you had asked Angie about things individuals can do. And I think one thing individuals can definitely do is positive engagement with their local governments or with their county governments when we're doing safety projects. I think probably people interested in this topic think that there's total consensus on this idea that roads should be safer and should be safer for pedestrians. But the fact is, when safety projects are in planning or pedestrian or bike projects are in planning, there are frequently people who object, and sometimes object very loudly. So I think it's important for people who are not necessarily in the advocacy world to show support to their elected officials and to city or county staff that they really like and appreciate improvements to safety, and that they think safety should have a high priority, and often a higher priority than vehicle capacity or delay for drivers. And I think so. Something the caller brought up is just setting lower speed limits. And for a long time, I think there was this attitude that people are just going to drive as fast as they feel like driving. But there's more recent evidence that under normal traffic conditions, probably not pandemic traffic conditions, but normal traffic conditions, just lowering the speed limit actually does have an effect on this. It reduces the driving speed.
So that's worth doing even without significant enforcement in some cases.
Yes, it can be. And there can be different types of enforcement that are not necessarily punitive. So, just having a radar speed sign up during a change in a speed limit alerts people to the fact that they may be going too fast. And the 85th percentile, which the caller noted, the fact is, there are lots of factors in cars that make them easier to drive fast than they used to be. They accelerate faster, they brake faster, and the fact that you may be able to drive in a manner that feels safe to you as a driver does not necessarily mean that that is the optimal speed for that road. And there's no law that says you can't set a lower speed limit because you want to prioritize safety or you want to prioritize the other functions of the roadway. So I think sometimes people in the engineering world will say, well, we can't do that because people want to drive 35 miles an hour here. But the fact is, you can have different priorities for a road, and you can do things to lower the speed they're going to drive at.
Well, I want to thank Shannon for sharing those observations. Let's go back to the phone lines. Justin is calling from South St. Louis. Justin, hi, you're on St. Louis on the air.
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious what the protocols and procedures are for what is happening in Webster Groves in the city, because at Shermer and Michigan, there was a little girl struck and killed right next to Lafayette Preparatory Academy coming out of their parking lot. a couple years ago, and petitions have been signed. The neighborhood has begged and begged. Just recently, somebody was driving through there so fast they took out the light pole that the stop sign was attached to, so people go even faster on that block now. Temporary stop signs been put in, and the city never responded. They just completely ignored the request for a speed bump.
Justin, that is so frustrating to hear, especially in a case where there was a fatality. Scott, any thoughts on where this needs to go or why the city would not have even responded, as Justin describes?
Well, I'm not familiar with that specific situation or the request for a speed hump, but our policy right now is that speed hump requests start with aldermen, and I would encourage people who are concerned to engage with their aldermen on that topic. We have I think dramatically increased interest from aldermen across the city in doing traffic calming measures, and we have requests, all the time now, which is a very different situation from a few years ago. In the last couple of years, we've installed over 200 speed humps and raised crosswalks. We will likely install dozens more next year in 2021. So I think we are trying to as funding allows, we're trying to be very responsive to the desire and the demand for safer streets in the city.
Well, that's good to hear. And Justin, thank you for that call. I hope you'll be able to get your alderman to maybe carry some water on this, because it sounds like that's what's going to be needed. Let's go back to the phone lines. Matthew is calling from Baldwin. Matthew, hi. You're on St. Louis on the Air.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. A very important conversation today. I just wanted to comment about also the Americans with Disabilities Act. I've places in the city and in the county where they have the rutted ramps for that, and then there's like a 3-inch drop off. I think it would be good to audit actually what those funds are, like even a federal audit or a state audit, because it seems to me like even with the problems with pedestrians and drivers, that's very obvious, and you've all talked about that very well. But I mean, as far as people with disabilities goes, it's like asking to just get hit, because there's no some of these places that they're supposed to be considered disability accessible, and they're just absolutely not. And it's a nightmare for someone in a wheelchair.
Matthew, thank you for that. And you make a great point, and Angie does a great job of addressing this in her book as well, that for people in wheelchairs, they are hit harder by these problems than any of the rest of us. Scott, we just have a couple minutes left, but real quickly, I know the city is working on an ADA transition plan. Can you give us just a very brief description of how that might fit into what Matthew's talking about?
Yeah, what Matthew brings up is absolutely true and very important, and we are engaged right now in work on an ADA transition plan, which is an assessment of actual conditions on sidewalks and in other places too, access to all public facilities. But specifically to sidewalks, the transition plan is making an assessment of some areas and a prioritization of what needs to be fixed and corrected first based on demand and usage. And that's a model that a lot of cities are moving to. We have kind of a shotgun approach to sidewalk repairs and improvements right now that is kind of a ward by ward thing, and oftentimes driven by adjacent property owners. I think we would, over time, we'd create a much more accessible city if we can transition that system to one where we're proactively identifying barriers or gaps in the sidewalk network and fixing them so that we don't have situations where wheelchair users are, cannot safely use a sidewalk and are forced into the street, or that we're also working internally really to, I think, tighten up our construction standards, because sometimes things are designed correctly, but they're not built correctly. And that situation he mentions where you have a perfectly usable curb ramp, but there's a vertical fall at the end of it down to the street is a construction problem. And if you don't build it right, then it ends up not being usable for somebody.
That's a great point. And Matthew, I want to thank you for bringing that up. We have time for just one last call. Tom is calling from St. Louis. Tom, you're on St. Louis on the Air. Hi.
Oh, hi. I'm sorry I was in the next room. Great show, great topic, excellent guest. This topic is very complex. It's a combination. I'm sure Scott would agree with this. It's a combination of road rage, people's stress levels these days. Some people are stoned, some are drunk, some are crazy, some just don't care.
Yeah.
And and this is horrible. I mean, the way I've lived in St. Louis all my life, and I've noticed a decline in appropriate, responsible driver behavior. And here's where I think might fix it. Number one, the idea of defunding the police is just stupid. I totally.
Well, Tom, I'm sorry. I hate to cut you off, especially when you're going into something that sounds political, because I'm not against discussing that issue. We've discussed it here on our show, but unfortunately, we are here in our last minute, and it's your observation is unfortunate, and it's been terrible to me to hear from so many people today who are so wound up about this and feel so strongly exactly what you're saying about selfish St. Louis drivers. And so, Tom, I want to thank you for sharing that perspective. And Scott Ogilvie, I always like to end on a note of hope, and that unfortunately wasn't it, but there is some hope here, and it's good to see the city is looking at these things more systematically. So I hope we can have you on again to talk about these issues as they continue to unfold and you guys continue to tackle them in the city.
Sure, of course. Happy to join anytime. And I'll say the most immediate thing people can do is take the responsibility of driving a vehicle seriously and realize that being inattentive or driving too fast can have terrible impacts to other people and yourself, and model good behavior.
Scott Ogilvie, transportation policy planner, we want to thank him so much for joining us today. If you learned something new from today's episode, consider leaving us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the easiest way to help people discover our show. We appreciate it. Thank you. Podcast episodes of St. Louis on the Air are available at stlpublicradio.org, or you can subscribe for free on Apple Podcasts, the Stitcher podcast app, or wherever you get your podcasts. St. Louis on the Air is produced by Evie Hemphill and Lara Hamden, with production assistance from Aaron Dorr. The senior producer is Emily Woodbury, and the executive producer is Alex Boyer. St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. That's 90.7 KWMU. Thank you for listening. I'm Sarah Fensky.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.